I don't know how old I was, but one time around Christmas time, I had a dream, and in that dream, my brother and I had been given gifts, and his was a toy airplane. And I remember in the dream, all I did was look at the Christmas lights. And I thought that that was really sad because it was so abstract and evanescent, you know, I mean, it just disappears, and it didn't make any sense to me. And I thought it was a sad dream. But now, years and years later, when I think of that dream, I think in some sense, it was pivotal to my survival as a human being, because I was raised by alcoholic parents who were really pretty abusive. And I'd say that to their face if they were alive. I mean, it's just a fact. And it was hellish living in that kind of environment. But in a therapy session a few years ago, when the therapist asked me how it is that I think that I survived, what came to my mind was a forest with a clearing, and in this dark forest there is this beautiful clearing where the sun is shining and it's beautiful. And to me, I think I found a clearing. I found sunlight. I found happiness. You could look at it as the Christmas lights. You could look at it as imagination. And I think it really, really saved me because things were pretty dark. And I think about that a lot now because as I look back on my life, I understand just how scary that time was. But to answer your question, I was born in Spokane, Washington. The family moved to Portland, I don't know, when I was a baby. I remember when I was 5 years old or something like that, having this instinct to write. And I wrote and illustrated a book called Mr. Man. And I don't think there was any plot, but I drew every page. Mr. Man, probably it was almost the same drawing. I don't really remember. I showed it to my parents and they had nothing to say about it. They didn't react at all. It seems to me that if they had been paying attention, that would have seemed like a really cool thing for a child to do when he was really young. But they didn't have that. And I cannot answer the question for myself of how it is that I can look back on my life and I can say that it was a happy one, even though there was a lot of horrible stuff that went on. And I mean, I've certainly dealt with depression, but I think that idea of the clearing or the Christmas lights has allowed me to imagine myself in a safer place, in a happier place. And it's thrilling, really, to be in that situation. I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy, short stories, and they helped a lot. I mean, they took me out of the world that I was in, and that was a great thing. I had a predilection for drawing. I like to draw, but that kind of went nowhere. I remember one time drawing a skeletal-looking cartoon woman and showing it to my uncle, and he said, "Oh, I don't like that." And I mean, it shut me down. I thought, well, okay, I'm not an artist, I can't draw. And there was nothing, no guidance to tell me I could write either. So The one thing where I was not having to be contested was listening to the radio and thinking that I could do that I could be a disc jockey, that I could be in front of an audience, but not really be there. I'd be behind a microphone and I'd be safe. And I just fell in love with the local DJs, particularly one guy named Barney Keep, who was the morning man at KEX here in town. And I idolized him. I wanted to be exactly like him. I can remember thinking that probably at least from the age of 15 or so, maybe even earlier. And then miraculously, I got a job out at a Hillsboro radio station. When I was in high school, I volunteered for the Portland Public Schools radio station, and I had an audio tape. It was a really bad, scratchy, off the air, almost inaudible tape. And I brought it to a production house to have it copied over. And it was the first time I encountered a person professionally who was kind and supportive. And this has been the theme really of my life, that I've run into people who are exceptionally nice and willing to give somebody a hand. What he told me is, this audio is crap, but for $15, and if you bring in some records, I have a little setup here. I'll play the records and record you as though you were really on the air being a disc jockey. Yeah, KWJJ had a production studio. And the head of that studio was a guy named Bill Rohrer. And he'd been an old sound guy for MGM, working on the sound stages back in the day. So he was an older man. He recorded that tape for me, and I brought it out to Hillsboro, to the little radio station, and they hired me. I was horrible on the air, but again, people can just be really nice. I mean, someone called that station, someone who was an advertiser on that station, and I had read their commercial. And that person said, if this person ever reads another one of my announcements, I'm pulling my advertising from your station. And the owner of that station, John Gillis was his name, reassured me, dude, he didn't say dude, it was a different era. But I was 17, that was crushing. But he had nothing but a smile on his face. And he just told me it was fine and not to worry about it. And the first time I was ever on the air, I came home from Hillsboro, 20 miles away from where I lived. I remember sitting on a sofa and feeling, I don't know what the chemical could possibly have been, endorphins. I was suddenly in heaven because of being on the air, because I'd achieved something, and I was not wrong. You know, worshiping the disc jockeys I heard on the radio, and then suddenly being one just felt exquisite to me. And it's that kind of fueling, that discovery ways to please myself so deeply, that I guess, and I've never really thought of this before, but it's a little bit like that's been a guiding light, because it's helped me move forward even when things seemed confusing and that there was no sense to be made of my life at all. But there was that. And my father, when he found out that I'd spent $15 to get this audio tape made, said, well, that's $15 you'll never see again. And, you know, I forgive him for all that. because, if I think my life was bad, his life was exponentially worse than that. But the funny thing is, when I became successful at that little radio station, it was the first time in my experience of my father that he actually related to me as a person and not a burden to him. And that was great, So then I went into the Army. And, before I got into the Army, I did get to work at that same radio station where my hero, Barney Keep, worked. And I'd be midnight to 6, and then he'd take over in the mornings, and he said, "Oh my God." He said it on the air. He didn't say it to me, and he didn't say, "Oh my God," either. But he said, "I have been at this station longer than the guy who was just on the air has been alive." And that was true, because I guess I was 21 or something at that time. And it was a way in my life, no matter what else was going on, where, I had something of my own. Went in the Army. That disrupted that career. I came back. I did work at that same radio station again and again. It's not Pollyanna-ish. It really is true that people, as I look back, honest to God, I'm not shining you on. These people were really wonderful to me. And I worked at that station again, but they didn't have a full-time job for me. And then the program director at that little station in Hillsborough, KUIK, was now at KPTV as the news director. And he hired me to be in news, no experience. And I discovered I could write. And the only downside of being a disc jockey, at least the way I was doing it, I'm sure if you have comedy writers or if you're really funny all the time, and I bet you I would have gotten a lot better at it, very likely it would have been more stimulating if I'd stayed in that business. But the fact is, at the level where I was, just mainly an announcer, there was no comparison between being in front of a microphone in a studio and being out covering stories, so that became more of my career. And then I got a job in Minneapolis where being a journalist was like a priesthood. You had to do it right, and you had to do it in a very specific way. They were 100% correct about how to produce a television story. They knew exactly how to do it right. But for someone who had no discipline at all at Channel 12, KPTV here in Portland, it was really hard, and it made me mad. I thought I knew what I was doing, and I didn't. But they held my feet to the fire, and I got better and better. And then when that station kind of had the wheels falling off, the people who owned that station were selling it. They were cutting back. It was a good time to leave. One of my bosses left. That was WCCO in Minneapolis. He left and got hired at OPB, Oregon Public Broadcasting, here in town, and then he hired me. And then for the next 20 years, I just had this great job driving around the state, going to the coolest places, hiking in different places, and then writing 10, 12-minute stories about all that. And working with the greatest people. I mean, there was one photographer. Our personalities were such, I think, that we trusted each other a lot. But we also fought a lot. He's still a really good friend. He lives mainly in Santa Cruz, and I go down for Christmas and see him because we are good friends. But man, when we were editing, we'd be yelling at each other, and there would be people thinking that we were really coming to blows because we both are the kind of people that are perfectly happy to raise our voices, and just yell at each other. And it was stimulating. It was energetic. It was a thrill to be so intensely committed to whatever we were doing that the only way you could let it out is by yelling and pounding, by the way, on the desk and all of that. And for a while, I told myself that when we were editing, I was probably right, about 75% of the time. But by the time my career was ending and I had a better view, I think it was true that he was probably right more than 50% of the time. It's really important to listen and pay. If you're going to be in television, if you are going to be telling a story to people you don't know and have never met, then it's a really good idea not to trust your ability to do it without guidance. And so before any story that I ever did went on the air, I had people watch it to make sure that I didn't jump the track somewhere. Because once it gets on the air, it could just be a blob. And mostly what I discovered being in television for a really long time is the audience won't blame itself. No, that's wrong. I said that wrong. The audience will blame itself. It won't blame the reporter or the producer, because they'll think their mind wandered, and it did. But the reason it wandered was because the producer did a crappy job, So that's a little bit of the science of that business. I think I held myself to a pretty high standard. I think because my self-image was pretty negative a lot of the time, I couldn't afford the shame of having a story that I'd done be incomprehensible when it went on the air. And so I came up with a formula for making sure that by the time something actually did get broadcast, and this is at Oregon Public Broadcasting, I made sure, and I think it was almost 100% the case, that before anything aired, one of two different people that I trusted at the station had to watch it and give me a thumbs up. Because those two people really understood that I meant it and that I was inviting real criticism and that they would tell me the truth. Because what can happen, at least in my experience when I was working there, if you invite the wrong people into the room to tell you how you're doing, the fact that you've done that is so flattering to them. They're so pleased, and they're not lying, but they're so pleased with you as the producer for inviting them in that they will give you the benefit of the doubt. That was great. That looks good. And that happened a lot. And I knew it wasn't true because when those other guys came in, they had such great valid points that there was just no question who was correct. One other thing that I would say is a tip for someone who is going to be in that business is that when you go out on the story, there's a tendency to be afraid that you don't know what the story is. I mean, let's say you're doing something on woodpeckers. Say, what about them? Well, they're looking for them. And there aren't as many, maybe, as there were a while back. Whatever the story is, what I found out is that a lot of times someone who is intrigued by the business is way too intimidated by the idea that it's now up to you, being out on the story and on the ground and working with the photographer to, in consultation with that photographer, get the shots that you want, ask the correct questions of the experts involved, come up with a narrative, and that means all the ancillary video that you're going to have to come up with. All of that has to be in hand when you leave the location, because you are not coming back. But what I discovered fairly early in my career is that there is no primary truth to be uncovered in one of these stories. It is absolutely the producer's creative prerogative to decide that. You make it up out of your imagination. You don't have to get it right. You have to come up with a way to intrigue the audience. That is the only thing you have to do. Well, that and be accurate. Those two things are fundamental, and they will carry you through. I mean, it's probably true that there is no other real issue there, other than, of course, knowing how to write well enough to be understood. You know, there are a lot of tricks also that might be going too far into the weeds. You'd have to tell me whether that's true or not. I left Oregon Public Broadcasting in 2009 because my body fell apart. You know, I had never really been an athlete. And then I was in the Army. And in the Army, because I was not an athlete, I didn't really know how to use my body right. But the fact is, they wanted you to run 20 miles. And they wanted you to do all these physically demanding kinds of exercises. So I just threw myself into it and didn't even think about it. And all my life, that's how I operated. And what happened to me is I wore out my body because in some cases the wrong muscles had taken over to do various jobs. The job I had, one of the great things about it was that you went hiking out in the woods, sometimes very rigorous hikes of lots of miles and steep terrain and heavy equipment. But I mean, the payoff was so exciting. It was just so thrilling to be out there that I did it, and I didn't even think. I didn't give any thought at all to my body, and then it wore it out. And so in 2009, I had my hips replaced. I went back to work, both hips replaced, and went back to work. The surgeon didn't understand what I did for a living. He said, sure, you can go back. Well, he saw some video of me later when my body was falling apart. And he said, oh, you never should have done that. And of course, I shouldn't have. It was just a mistake. And I couldn't do the job anymore. So I went on disability. And I'd always wanted to be a writer anyway, a fiction writer. So that's what I've been working on. I mean, even when I was in television in Minneapolis, and even when I was at Oregon Public Broadcasting, I was writing. And what I discovered is that writing for television actually undermines what you have to do if you're a fiction writer. I became more aware of the technique that I employed in television. The model that I had for writing a story for television was that I was talking to a 14-year-old boy who's drinking a beer. In other words, his attention span is negligible. And in order to get that kid to watch and understand what you're saying, I always made a point of repeating crucial elements of the story twice in different words. If you read the script, you might not even notice it, that I was saying effectively the same thing in different words. And also, I used heightened language. Because with this voice of mine, if I start sounding like this, the fact is, the power of the storm. You know, if you start talking that way, people, oh my God. And that's great for television, but it does not work for fiction. I mean, maybe it did back in the old Henry James days, but not post-Hemingway, it doesn't. And I had to relearn a lot because I tended to be pretty florid in my use of language because of that. And I also repeated myself because that's what I learned. I didn't understand that there might be a distinction. I just knew I was a writer. And I was a successful writer. So, I mean, I got complimented on it all the time. And that was really nice. So it gave me the fuel, I guess, to sit down at a typewriter and say, I'm a writer, so I can write, and I'm writing. And it's habitual, too. It's just like, well, I like using my mind that way. I like whatever synaptic pathways happen to be there, and they like it when I run electricity through them. It's just really cool. And then when it turned out that some of the time what was on the page was not going to attract an agent, well, then there's a moment of truth. And what I'm telling you now about the flaws in fiction writing that my habits had produced so that I probably wasn't marketable, I guess. And mind you, I got one small novel published by a press in Minnesota in 2015, and that was a high in my life. And the connection that you feel if someone gets it, what you wrote, that is a better high than being on the radio or being in television. It was the most wonderful thing. But I wrote a book about Vietnam, and I thought it was pretty close to getting published because a best-selling writer sent it to his publishing house. And that publishing house sent me a really nice letter of rejection. And I wrote that person and I said, well, do you know of an agent that might be willing to represent me? And he said, yeah, and he gave me a name, and that person rejected it too. So, at wit's end, I don't know what to do. And so for the first time since 1980, I decided to smoke marijuana to read what I'd written and see if that change in consciousness could tell me what was wrong. And I think it did, actually, because I understood that my language was too poetic and I wasn't telling the truth. I wasn't getting to what I really felt. I was turning my pain into poetry kind of thing. And that was silly. Because who cares about that? I mean, it's like if you have a story, you should communicate that. And so I rewrote it and I've rewritten it now. It's out to agents. We'll see. I did discover that I can't actually write stoned, but I can critique my work better if I somehow have shifted my brain somehow. This is going to sound like a cliche. I'm trying to, in terms of high points, sometime this summer, I got high and I just thought to myself, I really like the life that I've had. It just feels as though it's been a huge amount of fun. And part of it is the intense connection that you can have with some creative person that you're working with to make things happen. So, in terms of high points, I guess it's truly fair to say I've had a lot of them. I haven't won any awards. I got praised for the way I told stories, and that was a high, but that wasn't the highest part because I've always discounted that kind of thing. It was always being out there in the moment and enjoying the thrill of that. Now, in terms of low points, I'm a terrible ad-libber. There are guys that can go out on a shoot, do the interviews. There's a live truck out front. Oh, you're going to be on in 10 minutes. You're going to lead the story. You're going to lead the show today. So they do the intro, and they're, thank you, Fred. Yes, it's true that the riot that happened here, whatever it is, I can't do that. And sometimes I was stupid enough to not write it down. I mean, if I wrote it down, I could get through live shots. But there were times when I didn't. And it was like that camera lens was sucking every thought out of my brain. Now, there's no more excruciating pain than that. Here you're live, you don't know who's watching. And you cannot get a word out that makes any sense. And that really did happen. Sometimes I was masterful, sometimes. Like if they threw to me on a live shot and I wasn't expecting it, sometimes I could just flow. But I didn't trust myself. The guys that can really do it know that those, and it's true now on MSNBC or any of the networks, so much of it is live. It's self-selecting. Those are the people that have those jobs. I think the real reason that I left the job I had in Minneapolis and came back to Portland for Oregon Public Broadcasting was that Oregon Public Broadcasting wanted me for what was in fact my strong point, which was writing and reading scripts. It's all scripted. The show I was on, Oregon Field Guide, was a scripted show. So I was never going to have to go live. And no more pitfalls. They thought I was good in Minneapolis. Somehow they forgot those times. I didn't forget them. When I just went up in my line, so to speak, and couldn't talk worth crap, on live television. But they liked me well enough, and I could have stayed in that, but it was just way too much pressure for me. I didn't like that business. I didn't like the deadlines. That's another part of doing hard news is the deadlines. Man, they're just not joking around. That clock rules you. And because of the technology today, you can go live from anywhere at any time. It used to be way, way, way back. I started in the film era. It wasn't even electronic. It wasn't video. It was film. And so if you were outstate, like somewhere in northern Minnesota, you had to put the film on the bus. You do a track, record the narration, put it on the bus. Maybe you'd get back for the 10 o'clock, but you yourself and have dinner and go to bed. Not after the laugh trucks. It was just a lot of pressure. And it wasn't a gift of mine. I think I might be better at it now, but I was pretty neurotic. I mean, that abuse background of my childhood and into adolescence, it was pretty bad. And so I had no confidence in myself at all, just not at all. Well, somehow I must have known at some point that I was capable of generating internally a kind of pleasant sensation, that I could give myself pleasure by certain pursuits. And for whatever reason, some of it had to do with performing. And the obvious way for a kid from the suburbs with no expectation of anything, really, the one avenue that seemed open to me was radio. And there were tons of little stations, unlike today when everything is syndicated in a lot of these stations. The station I started at is off the air now. And so that door is closed, but it wasn't then. And so, yeah, on a day-to-day basis, I think it was true that when I went to bed at night, sometimes I would, if not in these words, I would think maybe in the abstract, I'm a disc jockey. I'm somebody. And then people would say, when I got on KEX, some people would be in California. It's a 50,000 watt station. Oh, we're driving up 101 and we heard you on the radio. Oh, God. There could be nothing more thrilling than that. And it was like, it showed me that there were rewards to be had from pursuing a discipline that in my case used certain attributes. Like I'm a fairly clear thinker, for one, and I've got a voice that people think of as authoritative or whatever it is they think. They like to hear it. So I learned pretty soon that if I employed that and if I employed it in a certain way and combined that with a certain kind of romantic language, then I was going to do well. What I missed out on, unfortunately, and didn't realize the pleasures of it, was acting. I mean, I thought acting was beneath me somehow. I mean, I thought it was clownish, at least on the level where I would be. Maybe not movie stars, but and now I know from taking lots of acting classes that the communion with other people through acting is extraordinarily powerful and energizing. I mean, the give and take in a scene is visceral pleasure, really. And I can see it in movies, and I know that the people who are really in the moment are enjoying the hell out of that experience. And I wish that I had known that, because I believe I would have pursued it and I would have honed that part of my mind to be able to tap more honestly into something very deep inside myself, which is what the really, really, really good actors do. And I know that I could do that, but I didn't know it then. And I think that the science of becoming a good actor is relaxing enough to get there. Now, when I was at Oregon Public Broadcasting, I wasn't doing a delivery, that is, my narration wasn't as true and honest as it might have been, because all I needed to do was sound like Oregon Public Broadcasting. I didn't have to try to discover what I sound like as a narrator, which is a whole different kettle of fish. And I know that now because I've taken classes in it, that finding the truth, your truth, in a script that you didn't write and maybe don't even like, is an amazingly difficult but valuable mental process. It's rewarding in and of itself to find the way to communicate words. It's an art form. And I didn't know that. And I wish I had known that, because it's a great thing. Television reporting I have never seen an honest depiction of what it's really like. It's a really insular profession. It's very ego-driven. And all I really cared about was not being wrong and not fucking up. Not somehow really screw it up so that I would be a laugh line. And that happens to people. That you're a little bit on a tightrope in that business. And while people are nice, the pressure's on, and nobody wants to be a fall guy. Nobody wants to make a really big mistake, which can, because it's so high profile anyway, it can turn into a public nightmare. And it's like, Lord preserve us, please don't ever let me fall into that. And when one is alive, like I had a psychotherapist once tell me, he says, whenever you're on the air, I just imagine that sometime soon you're gonna go nuts. That would really be interesting. Every time I see you when you're live, I just think, is he gonna go crazy now? What a terrible thing to say, because it's like, oh, now it's on my mind. Maybe I will, And when it happened, I that is a war story. I could tell you a horrible war story. It didn't happen to me. It ultimately, within a few months, a lot of people left the station because it was so terrible what happened live. And so those kinds of things could occur. And with the demand, it was really like producing sausages. You're just getting it done. You'd be writing longhand, coming back from the story, the photographer's driving, it's like, okay, now I got to type it up. Sometimes, if you had to, you'd read it off your handwritten script and then type it up so that the editor could start working on it, because you had a deadline. It had to go in the air, and that was your life. And it's like the next day, it's going to be the same. It's every time. It's the same. Now, the cool part is that you look cool on the air. You're the guy now. And you play that and you really believe it. You kind of have to believe it, because if you didn't, why would you do that? Because you didn't get that much money. Not in Minneapolis, you didn't. New York with the union and stuff, San Francisco, LA, sure. But not in Minneapolis. And so the coolness factor was in your head. It wasn't something that played out in any way that I ever noticed when I was shopping or something. And I wouldn't have liked that anyway. I wouldn't have liked being accosted and told that someone saw me on the air. But those rewards were imaginary. It wasn't It wasn't the fuel, it was the adrenaline. Look, getting on an airplane, getting on a helicopter, flying around in a helicopter, that, when I was whatever age, in my 30s, or a twin engine, flying to northern Minnesota, that was the reward. Not some coolness factor. And so it was visceral and very, very much internal. And even the creative part. I might have liked photographers in Minneapolis. I did. Actually, some of them are still friends. But the actual energy that came from building a story was only when I was at Oregon Public Broadcasting, because we could take a whole week to edit a story, and it was 10 minutes long, and you had to choose, what's the video here? Is the language right? Did you say it in the right way? Does the photographer agree with your take? So you're going to have a debate about all that. And man, when I had to leave that station, that's the only thing I missed, really, is that interaction, because you cannot buy it. You cannot choose to have that kind of intense, creative conversation with another person on your own. What are you going to talk about? We were talking about minutia. We were talking about the next edit. Did it go with the words? What's the sound you're going to put there? That was the coolest thing in the world, man. I remember starting writing this novel at my dad's grave. I just kind of felt that I guess I was looking for a certain kind of permanence. Self-analysis, I guess that's maybe what I was doing, wanting to be immortal. So I started writing by his grave. And that novel went through lots of permutations, and it still hasn't been published. But man, it was only like 2 years ago. 2018 is when I got it rejected by a big publishing house. And that was kind of final. And that was when I smoked some marijuana and realized that I had buried the truth in poetic writing. And so now I got to strip all that away and come to some truth. And that was very hard. And when you're writing fiction, there are lots of off-ramps. There are ways you can take the reader out of the story. I mean, Hemingway was a master, I think, at understanding that. The simpler his language, the less chance he was going to throw somebody out of the story before it was over. And I know I am very lucky. I have a woman that reads my stuff, and over time she has learned to be honest with me. And there was one scene that's been in that novel since she started reading it, and she had never noticed the scene until this last version, when I had taken out all the extra clauses. Any looping sentences are gone. I have chosen to use single syllable words instead of big words every time. And she got it, and she said, that is such a sinister scene. It just seems so scary to me. And it had been there forever. But that proved to me that there's a real science to fiction writing, and it is so intriguing to me. It's like food. It really fuels you to be able to get past that and really communicate. And I don't know. I think I have. I think I have with that book, actually, even if it doesn't get published. But the one that was published, which was about TV news in 2015, it's called A Habit of Mind. It was published by a small house in Minnesota. I know it's touched people. Not a lot. And I'm sure that people have read it and said, what? Who cares? Well, I know that happened. But I don't care about that. What I really love is almost this heart-to-heart connection, you know? So that's a pretty powerful reward. And it's worth investing hours and hours and hours and frustration after frustration because, well, good God, I mean, I've probably been writing that same novel for 30 years, the one about Vietnam, and realizing that, hey, man, it's like you still buried it in layers. I mean, it's like, how do you have a helicopter landing at a certain site? There's a water buffalo in a water hole. That water buffalo has been somehow blasted by a shell, but it's still alive. It's moaning there in the water hole. You get out of the helicopter. I get out of the helicopter with my captain. We see some Viet Cong soldiers that were killed, and they are in the concertina wire that surrounds this village, and they are all teenagers, and they have the back of their heads blown off. Well, how do you put all that in a narrative that flows with the conversations of the people? You want to somehow get in there, by the way, the cruelty to that animal, because the major, my captain, the guy that was my boss, is talking to this major, and I say something about whether you're going to have to shoot that water buffalo because it's suffering. And they say, well, you don't have refrigeration out here. Oh, so in other words, if it takes days, so be it. You know what I mean? It's that kind of thing you want it to just drop. You want it to hit without flagging it. And that is where the art comes in, that kind of, it's almost like the writer didn't notice. He's just taking stenography, just writing down what people said. Because it becomes very obvious very fast if you try to flag that. Oh, that poor suffering water buffalo. Audience, I want you to feel sad about that now. That kills it. And therein is that wonderful, that magnificent balance that you have to try. And I don't know. I mean, I think I found it, but I don't really know if I found it or not. But that's the art. That's the thing that's really, really appealing. You know, in the same way that I started writing because my dad died, well, was it therapy for that? Sure. But I go to the VA. I have a VA therapist for PTSD. So you could say that, yeah, Vietnam gave me PTSD. But I think that was from my parents and my brother when I was growing up. That's where that came from. That book's been around so long, most of it doesn't feel like it was therapy. It was more like what I think of as writing so simply that the emotion feels accidental on the page. It just feels like you didn't intend it. That's so much work that if there's therapy involved there, it's not like pouring your heart out in a journal. It's just not like that at all. But there was one scene where and mind you, this character is not me, not really, because a lot of the things that happened didn't happen to me. But there's a scene where somebody rescues him. The base camp is overrun by Viet Cong. And this is an all-night attack. And in the morning, the character who is nominally me is hiding in a shed. And a couple of Viet Cong come in. He hears them talking Vietnamese. He thinks they might be Republic of Vietnam soldiers. He thinks they might be friendly, but he's too scared to get up. And then this other guy who is my main character's enemy comes in, uses his M16 and blasts these guys because they really were Viet Cong. And my character is, I wouldn't say self-righteous, but he is so appalled by the bloodshed that he can't help appearing to criticize the person that saved his life by killing these guys. There's just something about him. He doesn't like the guy anyway. And I was writing that scene. That was a hard scene to write. Again, you're trying to make it seem like it just happened in the moment. And to get that balance right, I worked at it, and I realized there was something missing on the page, something about that whole attack. So because I really believe I am a writer, I didn't believe that it was beyond my ability to catch it. But I thought that I needed to sink more deeply. And I've discovered that that's true. You can sink more deeply into the scene and discover things that you didn't know were there. And I did that in that scene. And then the next morning, about 3 or 4 in the morning, I woke up and I had this horrible, depressing feeling. And I realized that I'd triggered my Vietnam PTSD there because I had sunk into that reality of that horror so deeply that it became real again, and I was having to process it. So that is what PTSD is. And those guys in Iraq and Afghanistan, those guys, a lot of them are in hell because they cannot find their way out of those sensations that are branded on their skull. You know, I mean, for me, I think I was pretty lucky. Maybe, yes, I can cry easily about Vietnam, but the damage those guys endured is much worse than what I had. This was just a nominal. I mean, I'm telling it to you as an anecdote now. Yeah, I had a bad night. Not the same. When I got stoned and read what I had written about Vietnam, I realized that, you know, it's like in a movie panning away to the clouds when something horrible's happened, you know, and the music wells up and you know it's really sad. And it's like, well, that's bullshit. You know, that doesn't really work. And so, no, I realize that truth comes in a lot of different ways, because one way it can be false is for me to be so arrogant as to believe that I can trick the audience with my artfulness to make them see what I want them to see. And most of the time, I'm off base if it's intense, if it's about emotion, if it's about something real like death or shame or any number of those emotions that most people try to avoid dealing with anyway. And it's just not, well, I want to say it's not fun to go there, but it's hard. You just have to learn how to cope. You just have to learn how to cope with yourself. Find a way that's honest and simple and true, because I'm dealing with myself. I'm dealing with my own unwillingness to suffer. It's just that simple, I think. You just don't want to suffer. You say, oh yes, I want to create art. I want to tell the truth. Sure, of course. But do you want to suffer? Well, no. And sometimes they're exactly the same thing. And I think that sometimes it's just work. Sometimes you just have to sit there and make the effort to go on and to trust that you can get there and know the difference, between bullshit and, something that's viscerally true. And afterwards, it feels pretty rewarding, I think. I mean, I've had a couple, on the Vietnam one, I've had a couple of people that I really respect give it a thumbs up. So I believe one of them, he was one of my bosses at WCCO. He was one of the guys that critiqued every story that went on the evening news, and I sent it to him because I believed, and he did have criticisms, and they were right. But in the main, he got it. He understood what I was doing, and he liked it. Catching a, and as you write dialogue, there's something really fun about creating people and having them talk and having it sound true and not be on the nose dialogue, For 20 years, I was a producer and narrator and writer for a show on Oregon Public Broadcasting called Oregon Field Guide. It was the job of a lifetime because we got to travel the state and sometimes out of state, do stories on science, do stories on adventure, do stories on the landscape, on the geology, on the archaeology. It was so much fun, so stimulating, really, and exciting to meet the people who really know about the ground and about the history and about the animals. It couldn't have been better, really. I think when I was a little kid, I wanted to draw. And I did draw. But I really never got any support for it. Mainly the feedback I got was pretty negative. I remember once in high school, I don't remember what this assignment was in art class, but my character that I drew was kind of cartoony. And it made the art teacher mad. At least that was my experience of it. That he really thought I was somehow pulling his leg or dissing him in some way by diminishing the assignment to a cartoon. Whereas that's what I do. But I like painting. All of my paintings are mainly, well, not all of them, but most of them are really cartoonish. And what I look at, what I think is happening is I'm having a debate with color and form. I'm trying to put on paper in 2 dimensions something, a design that pleases me. And it works out for me a lot of the time, but it does feel like a debate. It feels like I think this will work. And part of my brain is saying, no, this won't work. And finally, by massaging the image, by changing the colors, whatever I'm doing, it turns out that I've got something that essentially pleases me. That's what I'm trying to do. I don't really know what my motivation is, except just that general idea of trying to be creative. And it's all cartoons. I have a friend who seems to particularly like my drawings. And he's a blessing to me because I wouldn't do as much. I wouldn't mess with it as much as I do if I didn't have this audience of one who is pleased when he sees my work. You know, I discovered pretty early on that my paintings, at least while I'm alive, are marketable because I don't think people want to hang cartoonish pictures in their house. They want beauty. They want bucolic scenes of a landscape, or they want flowers. I don't know what they want. I look, if you look at the work of Matisse, that's a whole different kettle of fish. That's why he's in museums. That's not me. I mean, he's brilliant. And what I do is really facile. It's good in a way. I mean, they're pleasing. Some people really love them, but it's on a different order of magnitude. It's somewhere below Matisse, right? And Monet and all of those great artists. So I did what I did. Again, I'm a dilettante. I mean, just like when I was a disc jockey, I never was a disc jockey for so long that I refined it into an art form, as some people have done. It's true for acting now. You know, maybe I did that a little bit at Oregon Public Broadcasting, long form narration. That may be true. And also the writing, I've certainly put a lot of energy into that. But the painting is something that I have done when I wasn't writing. Somehow that same energy, that need to please myself, can take that form. I can get there in my head by putting paint on paper, you know, and enjoying the result of that. And that's the only way I can explain it. It's like, I don't know why I paint, really. And I guess to communicate like you do with writing, but it's a whole different kettle of fish, obviously. So, yeah, but I do that. And I have paintings hanging all over my house, and they're all mine. And I don't mind having them on my wall. They do not bore me or annoy me or anything like that. And I have a brother-in-law who had to sell his house. But he has kept some of my paintings, and his children wanted the other ones. And that pleased me to no end. That has nothing to do with money. That has to do with a certain kind of validation that somehow what I found pleasurable for myself has pleased somebody else too. And that's why I've liked my life. Because I've had avenues, and I still have them. And it's fun to do all these things and to explore. It's a kind of exploration. Finding out what color can do. I mean, you changed it to blue, and now it's a shadow, you know? You had dimensionality to a piece that way. You bring things forward, you know, a little gloss on the end of somebody's nose, that kind of thing. It's great. Well, when I look back at my life, I think it could have turned out really badly, and sometimes I wonder why I didn't kill myself, because it was that bad. You know, and I know that I look at other family members and I know what happened to them. And it was bad. But that didn't happen to me. And I think that I was blessed by a certain facility that for whatever reason they didn't have or they didn't discover. I discovered it for myself. I found a way to give myself pleasure through creative avenues, whatever they are, having to do with the use of my voice, maybe having to do with painting, having to do with how I use words. And all of those things produced a circumstance where it put me in positions where I had experiences I might not otherwise have had, like being a news reporter, being able to fly around in helicopters, being able to hike all around Oregon Territory and find out exciting things. All of those things happened because of this pursuit of mine, which could be put in the category of art. And it isn't really over, because even though I'm not on television anymore, I still can paint and draw, and I do, and I can still write, and I do. And I can tell you that is every bit as pleasurable now as it has been ever since I discovered I could do those things. So I'm happy, really. I guess I'm just plain happy with my life.